In the summer of 1847, a small wooden ship slipped out of the harbour at Arbroath on the east coast of Scotland and headed into the open North Sea. On board were 24 men. Some were masons who had spent their lives cutting granite in the quarries around Aberdeen. Others were sailors, blacksmiths, carpenters, and labourers. They carried pickaxes, ropes, iron bars, and enough food to last a month. Their destination was a reef called the Bell Rock, also known as the Inch Cape, sitting 11 miles offshore. At low tide, the rock surfaced from the sea like a long, red, razor-edged spine, slick with weed and spray. At high tide, it vanished completely beneath several feet of grey water. No structure of any kind had ever survived on it. The men had been hired to build a lighthouse there, on a rock that disappeared twice every single day. The Bell Rock was one of the most deadly hazards in British waters. For centuries, ships travelling the east coast of Scotland, or making for the Firth of Tay, had struck the reef without warning. The rock lay just beneath the surface most of the time, invisible from a ship's deck until the vessel was already on top of it. Historical accounts estimate that thousands of lives were lost on the Bell Rock before any permanent warning was placed there. The reef was named after a legend that monks from Arbroath Abbey had once fixed a bell to the rock on a floating buoy to warn sailors. According to the story, a pirate cut the bell loose and the reef returned to silence. Whether the legend was true or not, the danger was real. In 1804, the 64-gun warship HMS York struck the Bell Rock and was torn apart. Every one of its 491 crew members died. That disaster finally forced the hand of the Northern Lighthouse Board, the body responsible for lighting the Scottish coast. A plan that had been sitting rejected for years was pulled out and examined again. The plan belonged to a 30-year-old engineer named Robert Stevenson. Born in Glasgow in 1772 and raised in poverty after his father's death, Stevenson was largely self-taught. He had become engineer to the Northern Lighthouse Board in 1797, inspecting the few crude warning lights that existed along the Scottish coastline. Most of these were nothing more than open coal fires burning on headlands, easily extinguished by rain, and often useless in the worst weather. Stevenson had visited the Bell Rock in 1800 and come away convinced that a stone tower could be built on it. The board had rejected the idea as impossible and far too expensive, with an estimated cost of over £42,000. After the loss of HMS York, they could no longer delay. The eminent English engineer John Rennie was appointed chief engineer. Stevenson was made his resident engineer, the man who would actually live on site and oversee the work. Rennie remained at his practice in London and visited the rock only twice during the entire 4 years of construction. Everything else, every stone, every worker, every crisis, fell to Stevenson. The design was based on an earlier lighthouse built on the Eddystone Rocks off Cornwall by John Smeaton in 1759. Smeaton had shaped his tower like the trunk of an oak tree, wide at the base and tapering upward, so that waves would slide around it rather than strike it flat. Rennie insisted on a gentler curve at the base, a more gradual slope of about 40 degrees, to better deflect the violent seas of the North Sea. He also required that the stone blocks be locked together with dovetail joints, the same interlocking technique Smeaton had used, so that each stone would hook into its neighbours like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. The idea was simple and brilliant. When a wave slammed into the tower, the force would push the stones tighter together instead of pulling them apart. Rennie further demanded that the lower courses be pinned with oak tree nails and wedges driven into holes bored through the stone. Gravity alone would not be enough to hold the tower in the first years. It needed to be mechanically locked to the rock itself. The first challenge was simply reaching the reef. Stevenson purchased a captured Prussian vessel called the Tonga Gerrit, renamed it the Pharos, and converted it into a floating light ship. It was 67 feet long, 16 feet wide, and registered at 82 tons. It carried 10 lamps with silver-plated reflectors and was moored just over a mile from the rock to serve as a temporary warning light and a base for operations. A second vessel, the Smeaton, 42 tons and 55 feet long, served as a tender and stone lighter, carrying dressed stone from the harbour at Arbroath out to the reef. 2 pram boats, flat-bottomed and shallow-drafted, ferried stones from the Smeaton to the rock itself. Later, a larger schooner, called the Sir Joseph Banks, 84 tons, and capable of sleeping 40 artificers and 15 crew, joined the fleet. The workforce was roughly 110 men in total, though they were never all on the rock at the same time. About 60 were artificers, meaning masons, smiths, carpenters, wrights, mortar makers, and labourers. 35 were seamen, who handled the vessels and boats. 15 were executives and heads of various departments. 10 of the masons were brought specially from Aberdeen because of their experience working with granite. A single workhorse named Bassie pulled a heavy sling cart, carrying stones from the workyard in Arbroath down to the harbour. The men were paid £1 per week, and that included their food. Their daily rations were 1 pound of beef, 1 pound of ship's biscuits, 8 ounces of oatmeal, 2 ounces of barley, 2 ounces of butter, 3 quarts of beer, plus vegetables and salt. Each man served a month at a time, with no shore leave in between. Because Britain was at war with France, workers were issued protection tickets to prevent them from being seized by the press gang and forced into naval service. Even so, 2 seamen deserted the moment they learned what the job actually involved. The working window was brutally narrow. The Bell Rock was exposed for only a few hours each day at low tide, and even that was only possible during the calm summer months. In the earliest days, the men had roughly 2 hours of usable working time per tide. Everything else was spent waiting on the Pharos or the Smeaton, rolling in the swell, almost constantly seasick. Some men ate dulse, a type of seaweed, trying to settle their stomachs. The work itself was primitive. They used pickaxes to cut into the red sandstone of the reef, trying to level a foundation pit 42 feet in diameter and 14 to 24 inches deep. Stevenson refused to use gunpowder because he feared it would fracture the rock itself and undermine the foundation. So every inch of the pit was cut by hand, with pickaxes that needed constant resharpening by a blacksmith who often worked standing up to his knees in freezing seawater. The men sometimes kept working even as the tide rose around them, continuing until they were knee-deep before finally retreating to the boats. In September 1807, disaster nearly ended the project before it had properly begun. The Smeaton broke free from her moorings while 32 men were working on the rock. They had only 2 small boats to get back to the vessel, and those boats could not carry everyone at once. The men were stranded on a reef that was about to disappear under the tide, with no ship in sight. They were eventually rescued, but 18 of them refused to go back to the rock the next day. A short time later, a severe storm severed the Pharos from its moorings as well, nearly driving it onto the very rock it was supposed to protect. These were not rare events. They were the ordinary texture of working on the Bell Rock. To reduce the daily danger of boat transfers, Stevenson ordered the construction of a beacon house, a wooden barracks built on stilts above the rock. It rose above the high water mark on iron and timber legs. The exterior was painted with 3 coats of white lead paint. The walls were packed with moss for insulation against the damp and cold. The roof was lined with tarpaulin. Inside, the walls were covered with green baize cloth to give it what Stevenson called a comfortable appearance. It had multiple levels. The lowest was the mortar gallery, where cement and materials were mixed. The upper levels served as sleeping quarters and a space for Sunday prayers. When the sea was calm, it was a refuge. When the storms came, the entire structure shuddered and groaned. Waves sometimes broke into the mortar gallery and swept away lime casks, tools, and anything else not tied down. On one occasion, 30 men crowded into the top apartment while the sea raged beneath them, and 2 artificers joined hands to hold up a Bible for the Sunday service. The stones for the lighthouse were quarried from multiple sites across Scotland. The granite for the outer casing came from Rubislaw near Aberdeen and Cairngall near Peterhead. The sandstone for the inner courses came from Milnerfield near Dundee and Craigleith in Edinburgh. The mortar was a complex blend. Lime came from Aberthaw in Wales. A volcanic material called pozzolano, similar to the cement the Romans had used, was imported from Sicily in Italy and Andernach in Germany. Sand was obtained locally. Roman cement was used for the outside grouting. Every block was cut and dressed to exact shape in the workyard at Arbroath before being loaded onto the boats. The first complete course alone contained 123 interlocking blocks. The second course had 136 stones and weighed 152 tons. Many of the lower blocks weighed more than a ton each. The granite stones measured between 4 and 7 feet in length and 3 to 4 feet in breadth. In the first course, workers drove 246 oak tree nails and 378 pairs of wedges to lock the stones to the reef and to each other. The process was slow, exact, and unforgiving. A single poorly cut stone could compromise the entire ring. When the tide allowed, stones were ferried to the rock on pram boats, lifted by cranes, and lowered into position. The cranes were designed by Stevenson's foreman, Francis Watt, a man whose name has largely been forgotten, alongside the workers he helped lead. Watt devised both the lifting cranes and the temporary barracks. A movable beam crane and a balance crane were used at different stages as the tower rose. Because the working hours were so short and the tides did not always cooperate with daylight, the men often worked at night by torchlight. Over the 4 construction seasons, they burned 690 flaming torches called flambeaux, handheld firelights that cast flickering orange shadows across the wet stone. The second season, 1808, was when the real stonework began. The foundation stone, inscribed with the date 1808, was laid. The first 3 courses were completed, but the season also brought the first serious casualties. In the workyard at Arbroath, a mason named Hugh Rose was working beneath a carpenter's jack when a stone block, weighing between 2 and 3 tons, slipped and landed on his knees. He was permanently disabled. The Northern Lighthouse Board granted him an annuity of £20 per year. On the rock itself, a mason named John Bonnyman nearly lost a finger while operating the movable beam crane. He was rushed back to Arbroath, but the finger had to be amputated. He later became a lighthouse keeper. The worst loss came at sea. A young seaman named James Scott and the mate Thomas McCurich were making fast a hawser when a mooring buoy broke free in the fast tidal current and smashed into their boat. Both men were thrown into the water. McCurich was rescued. Scott appeared to have been knocked unconscious. He drowned. He was one of 5 men who died during the entire construction. 1 died on the rock itself, 1 in the Arbroath workshop, and 3 in separate accidents at sea. The names of most of the men who built the Bell Rock Lighthouse were not preserved in any great detail. Stevenson praised them in his written account, published in 1824, describing how they always went from Arbroath to their work cheering, and how between tides they amused themselves reading, fishing, playing music, cards and draughts. In the workyard at Arbroath, the young men attended evening classes in writing, arithmetic, and architectural drawing. They were not uneducated men thrown into labour. They were skilled workers who chose to learn more, even after days spent knee-deep in freezing water with pickaxes in their hands. But the historical record preserves only a handful of their names. The rest, the hundreds of days of their labour, the aching cold, the salt sores, the fear when the sea rose faster than expected, exist only in the stones they placed. Those stones have held for over 200 years without a single repair to the masonry. If you are moved by stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary and dangerous work, consider subscribing to this channel. We uncover these forgotten chapters because the hands that built the world deserve to be remembered. The 1809 season was the most productive and the most punishing. The tower rose from the 4th course to the 26th, reaching a height of 31 feet 6 inches above the rock by late August. The 10th course brought the building clear of high water at neap tides, meaning the lowest tides no longer covered the working surface. For the first time, the men could stand on dry stone and work without the sea lapping at their boots, but the weather fought them at every step. On the last day of May, it snowed so heavily that 3 inches of snow accumulated on the decks of the vessels. Temperatures throughout the season rarely exceeded 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In June, a severe gale struck the rock. On one occasion, a large wave struck the building with such force that the whole fabric shuddered. The blacksmith's anvil was washed away. Lime casks were swept from the mortar gallery. One of the iron legs of the shear crane was broken. In July, the British government placed an embargo on all shipping around the coast due to the war with France, cutting off supply runs for 10 days. In August, heavy swells prevented any boat from approaching the rock at all. The season also took more from the workforce. Michael Wishart, one of the principal builders, was seriously injured when a crane collapsed, and a labourer named William Walker was killed when a stone fell on him. He died a few hours later. Stevenson recorded these losses in his account, but he also recorded the spirit of the men. When the artificers returned to Arbroath at the end of a season, having made good wages, they spent the evening in what Stevenson called innocent mirth and jollity. They were working men who understood exactly what they were risking, and they chose to go back. The final season of 1810 pushed the tower to its full height. Courses continued to rise, the walls narrowing as the tower tapered. At the 39th course, the wall thickness was reduced from 5 feet 9 inches to 3 feet 2 inches. The 85th course brought the tower to 97 feet 9 inches, with an outer diameter of only 13 feet 6 inches. Each of the 8 stones in that course was 7 feet long and weighed over a ton. The 90th and final course of masonry was completed on Monday, the 30th of July, 1810. The total height from foundation to the top of the lightroom was 115 feet 10 inches. In all, 2,835 stones had been used. The total weight of the masonry, the lantern, and its apparatus was 2,083 tons. Stevenson himself laid the last stone on the upper step of the stair. The tower was hollow above the 26th course, containing 5 apartments. A provision store, a lightroom store with 7 copper oil cisterns, a bedroom for 3 keepers, a kitchen, and a library. A stone staircase of 32 feet rose from the entrance door to the living quarters. The lightroom at the top was built of cast iron with copper and brass fitments, holding 24 parabolic reflectors, each 25 inches across, made of silver-plated copper. The reflectors were arranged on a revolving frame. 2 sides had 7 reflectors each, and 2 sides had 5 each. Red-colored glass panes were placed in front of the reflectors on the minor sides, giving the bell rock its unique alternating red and white flash. The light completed a full revolution every 8 minutes, with a 4-minute cycle between flashes. It was powered by argand burners using spermaceti oil, a fuel drawn from the head cavities of sperm whales. 48 glass panels, each 13 inches by 26 inches and a 1/4 inch thick, enclosed the lantern in an octagonal frame. 2 alarm bells sat on the balcony to warn ships in fog. From an elevated position on land, the light could be seen at 35 miles. On the 1st of February, 1811, the 24 great lanterns were lit for the first time. The Bell Rock Lighthouse, the world's oldest surviving sea-washed lighthouse, was operational. The total cost, including the signal tower complex built on shore at Arbroath to communicate with the rock, was £61, 331 shillings and 2p. The stonework has never required a single repair since the day it was completed. The dovetailed blocks, locked together with oak tree nails and wedges, have withstood every storm the North Sea has unleashed for more than 2 centuries. The tower was manned by keepers who served in isolation, originally 6 weeks on the rock, followed by 2 weeks on shore, a pattern that later changed to 2 months on and 1 month off. During the Second World War, the lighthouse was attacked on 4 separate occasions by enemy aircraft. The lantern, lenses, and balcony were damaged. Keepers were trained on Hotchkiss machine guns, and gun platforms were erected on the balcony. No keepers were injured. On the 24th of October, 1988, the lighthouse was fully automated. The last keepers left. The light, now producing 1,900,000 candela with a range of 18 nautical miles, is controlled remotely from Edinburgh by the Northern Lighthouse Board. It is a story about what human hands can do when the work matters enough to risk everything. If these stories matter to you, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what forgotten structures or workers you think deserve to be remembered.